Today, we're going to talk about family accommodation.
Welcome to the ADHD Parenting Podcast with Mike McLeod of Grow Now ADHD and Ryan Wexelblatt of ADHD Dude. Learn about parenting kids with ADHD from a licensed clinical social worker and speech-language pathologist who specializes in ADHD. No fluffy parenting advice, only practical information that will equip you to help your child with ADHD effectively.
So when parents hear the term accommodation, they often think it means school accommodation, and that certainly is one kind of accommodation. So I think we should start off, Mike, by talking about the difference between, what are school accommodations and when accommodations are useful. And then let's explain what family accommodation is and why that is not useful to kids. Yeah, start off by talking about, school accommodations and what that means.
Of course. So a school accommodation is what you get with a 504 plan, for example. So 504 is not a list of therapies and goals. It's really just some accommodations to help the student be able to access the curriculum, maintain in the classroom, and have some school success with their, learning needs and learning differences. So it's different ways to help aid them in the classroom. So an example of an accommodation could be sitting at the front of the classroom or having preferential seating, which is a great accommodation for a kid with ADHD to sit in the front. Another accommodation could be, the teacher comes by and taps on their desk a little bit to make sure that they're up and paying attention. Or a great accommodation would be that they're checking in on them more often to make sure they're doing the right thing on their Chromebook or staying on task or having some sort of fidget or movement breaks. All of those things are very appropriate for ADHD kids. But that's school accommodations as part of IDEA and 504s and IEPs. Then there's family accommodations. So family accommodations are very, very different. When it comes to ADHD and home executive functioning, which we've talked about a lot on this podcast, home executive functioning is the child's self-regulation towards parents and ability to initiate, persist, and complete non-preferred tasks in the home environment. What we tend to see are parents intentionally and also unintentionally fall into these traps of accommodation that accommodate their child's inflexibility, different ways to keep their child in their comfort zone in the home and keep them from having to initiate and persist non-preferred tasks at home. So they're accommodating that ADHD mental rigidity.
So basically, to say it in a simple way, family accommodation is when parents change their behavior to alleviate or avoid their child's temporary distress. So families accommodate around anxiety, which is a big one. As Mike just mentioned, families accommodate around inflexibility. Some families, accommodate around school avoidance, which is, a form of anxiety typically. They, accommodate around emotional dysregulation, as Mike just mentioned. And they do a lot of accommodating around screen time. So when we talk about family accommodation, we're talking about behavioral adaptations parents make basically to keep kids from, blowing up or getting into arguments, or emotional dysregulation. The problem with family accommodation or parental accommodation, whatever you want to call it, is this, that the research data shows that family accommodation makes things worse, not better.
Absolutely. So in terms of family accommodation, that accommodation of the inflexibility, anxiety, school avoidance, emotional dysregulation, and that screen time, what the parents are doing is dealing with these ADHD behaviors in the home, which can be incredibly exhausting and lead to burnout and really a toxic environment in the home, because these ADHD kids with their lack of future thinking skills and learning from the past, these behaviors can really be relentless, and the parents end up getting exhausted. Many parents themselves have ADHD, and oftentimes we fall into these traps of accommodating this inflexibility, accommodating their various ADHD executive dysfunction behaviors, which ends up doing the opposite of what we want. It feeds into the behaviors and causes the child to do them more because they're having so much success with it.
So I think we should give some examples of what family accommodation looks like. So first example, if we're talking about anxiety, family accommodation around anxiety can look like, parents allowing the child to sleep in their bed because they're scared to sleep in their bed. Or, if a parent leaves and the child keeps calling them over and over, asking, when are you going to be back? They keep answering the phone to tell them when they'll be back. Anxiety around inflexibility would look like if, I'm going to let actually Mike give an example because he's dealt with this a lot when parents have reached out to him for, executive function treatment. And, you give the example, Mike, of what it can look like around inflexibility.
Where there's so many different things. Probably the most often thing I hear is on those very first intake calls I do with parents, where the number one concern that every single parent has, bar none, the second they call me is, how am I going to get my son to agree to do this? And when I go up to him, how do I describe it to him? What should I say to him? How do I sell him on it? How do I motivate him on it? Which is the wrong mindset to have altogether. You're not selling your child or trying to convince him to do something. That's really our responsibility as the coaches to motivate your child, not the parents. So the parents need to kind of step back there. But in terms of overall inflexibility, you see this quite often. This is probably the number one family accommodation. So this is that ADHD kid's favorite word, which is no. I'm not going to do that. I'm not doing that. So when we see the ADHD comfort zone, which tends to be 1, 2, 3 things, Fortnite, Roblox, Minecraft, YouTube, those kinds of things, anything outside of that gets a no. So whether it's you need to clean your room, you need to start your homework, you need to go brush your teeth, you need to go outside, you need to go do something with your friends this weekend, you need to get a job this summer. All of those things tend to be met with no and significant rigidity, lack of mental flexibility. So when families allow their kids to say no to those things and escape those new, challenging, non-preferred tasks, that's accommodating the inflexibility.
I'm going to give an example of family accommodation around school avoidance. So let's say, the child says, I'm not going to school. And the parent just, kind of throws up their hands and says, okay, well, I guess you're not going to school then. And they feel kind of powerless that there's nothing they can do. So they just accommodate the anxiety, or one of the worst things I've seen parents do. And I'm not blaming them for this. I want to be clear. Rather, they've either received bad advice or they weren't receiving advice at all. So let me give an example. So a few years ago, I had a boy at camp who was experiencing some anxiety. And one of the things that, his parents did was they let him, transfer out of his public high school and enroll in a cyber charter school. Well, that's one of the worst things you can do for school avoidance because then you're not facing your anxiety. So, again, they weren't doing this because they necessarily wanted to accommodate him. They just weren't getting any guidance, at the time. Mike, why don't you give an example of family accommodation around emotional dysregulation?
Absolutely. So this is what tends to happen when kids with ADHD will use their emotional dysregulation to gain some sense of control amongst their parents. The parents could be working, they could be, making dinner, cooking, cleaning, giving attention to a sibling. So the child will use their emotional dysregulation to get some attention, become the center of attention, to avoid a non-preferred task, whatever it may be. So using big words, shock value language, yelling, screaming, really insulting their parents, sometimes even some physical aggression towards parents. And what the parents will do is accommodate that emotional dysregulation by lowering those demands or giving in and providing attention when the child is dysregulated. So instead of walking away, providing a sentence or two and walking away, the parent also getting dysregulated, the parents yelling back at the child, lecturing the child when they're dysregulated, or just lowering the demands or doing things for them, doing the entire task for them that got them emotionally dysregulated. That's accommodating that dysregulation.
And the last one we'll talk about is family accommodation around screen time. So for a lot of kids with ADHD, they can become explosive or argumentative when told to get off screens, particularly if there's no strategies in place to help them be able to visually see a transition. So a lot of parents give kids, excessive amounts of screen time because they don't want to deal or they don't have the emotional energy to deal with the arguing and so on. However, when you, engage in accommodation around screen time, well, then it sends kids a message that, as long as you argue enough, or as long as you, have a blow up or make threats, this is going to work for you to get more screen time. So before we get into talking about steps to reduce family accommodation, we want to explain to everybody that, if some of this is resonating with you and some of the examples we've said, and you feel like, you know what, I've been accommodating a lot, we want you to know that this is not about blame. Okay. It's not about doing anything wrong. Rather, this is about you learning how to not accommodate your child because you want them to be successful. And when kids are successful, that's how they develop self-confidence. Because remember, self-confidence comes from recognizing your abilities within yourself, not from people giving you assurance how great you are. So just keep that in mind. All right. So first thing, steps to reduce parental accommodation. What I always teach parents is you tell the child what you, the parent, needs to change, not what they need to change. Because parental accommodation requires parents taking responsibility for accommodating and owning that to their child and presenting it in a way of saying, look, we've been doing some things that have not been helpful to you, and here's what we're going to change. And I talk about this, I get more in depth in my Scaffolding Better Behavior program, but essentially the idea is we're never telling the kids that they need to change anything. Rather, we are telling them what we are changing. So that's number one.
And that's very similar to what I tell parents when they've made the massive mistake of filling their house with screens, and screens end up becoming an issue. So instead of going to your child and saying, you're addicted, this is called, you're causing problems, you're dysregulated, make it about yourself. Approach your child and say, it's our mistake. We gave you a phone before you were ready. We gave in to the social pressures. We bought all of these things that you could not resist. And that's why you don't want to go outside anymore. That's why you're so angry. That's why you don't hang out with your friends in person anymore. So all of this technology, this was our mistake. We should not have gotten you all of this. So that's what needs to change in this house. I'm not removing screens from you. We're removing them because we made that mistake as parents.
You want to talk about number 2, Mike?
So step number 2 is to step into your parental authority, which is so unbelievably important for parents to understand this, is when you learn to be an authoritative parent that is warm, gentle, nurturing, but you are a strong emotional leader in your home because you set clear boundaries and high expectations. You step into your parental authority with your authoritative voice and presence, where you are modeling regulation, you're modeling calmness, you're setting clear standards in the home of what's accepted, what's not. It's not constant negotiating. You're not getting stuck in that negotiation argument vortex on a daily basis because your child knows these are the clear standards. These are the clear rules. There's nothing to negotiate here because I know what's acceptable and what's not acceptable in my house, just like so many of these kids who do very, very well at school but have very poor behavior at home because they know what's acceptable at school. They know what gets them in trouble and what doesn't. At home, it's not as black and white. It's a little bit more gray area, and I can actually negotiate at home. I can argue at home, and I can get my way by doing those things. If you're an authoritative parent, you avoid arguments, you avoid negotiations because it's clear already to the child what's right and what's wrong.
And for those of you who are listening to this thinking, well, I don't want my child to not feel heard, or I don't want to lose connection with them, or any of these, hypothetical, catastrophic, results you think are going to happen from this. What you should know is that there's decades of research showing that authoritative parenting produces the best mental health outcomes and overall the best outcomes for all kids. Whereas authoritarian parenting, which is basically, do what I say and don't ask questions, that is not healthy for kids. And I just heard this yesterday, Mike, that permissive indulgent parenting, which is really popular right now on social media, actually has worse outcomes than even authoritarian parenting.
Yeah, and that's quite a fascinating stat with permissive parenting. And the best way to define permissive parenting is how you overindulge your child to avoid conflict. That's the real simple definition of what permissive parenting is. And we know conflict, the ADHD brain, is conflict seeking, highly stimulated by conflict. So they'll seek conflict via negotiation and arguing. But if we don't follow permissive parenting, because so many ADHD parents unintentionally fall into this idea of overindulging their child to avoid the constant dysregulation and arguing. What we are telling you is that we don't have to do that. We can have high expectations, clear standards, where we're not arguing, we're not negotiating, we're walking away from the dysregulation, not feeding into that stimulation, and it ends this cycle.
All right, so the next one is something I teach, and it's called enlisting supporters. Supporters are people who the child respects. It can be an aunt, uncle, grandparent, teacher, youth group leader. It can be an older cousin, family friend, neighbor. And the idea with supporters are they are people who just offers their unconditional support to your child when they are struggling. So when you reduce family accommodation, it's very common that behaviors will get worse. And supporters are people who will reach out to your child and say, "Hey, I know you're having a hard time with this. What can I do to help you?" So the idea, there's two things with enlisting supporters. Number one is we want the child to feel supported by other people because, kids need a village, around them to support them. And whatever your village looks like is totally fine. There's no right or wrong way for that to look. All right. But the other reason we enlist supporters is because often when behaviors deteriorate, when parents stop family accommodation, a lot of times kids with ADHD in particular, they don't like their poor treatment of family members to be known to people outside of the family. They want to keep these behaviors a secret. Why? Because they would feel embarrassed if people they would respect know about them. Well, here's the deal. When they know that people who care about them are going to know about their behaviors, that often stops them or significantly reduces them. And I want to be clear, enlisting supporters is not about telling on the child. You're not tattling. You're not threatening and say, "I'm going to call Uncle Jim if you keep doing this," right? They're people who reach out and just offer their unconditional support. So, "Hey, Ryan, I heard you're having a hard time treating your mom the way she should be treated. I care about your mom and I care about you. What can I do to help you?" That's the role of a supporter. So whenever you're going to reduce family accommodation, it's really important to enlist supporters so your child can feel supported.
Exactly. And the goal here is not to embarrass the child and make them, feel embarrassed. It's to bring somebody else in to hold them accountable and have those conversations. That's really what it's all about. So this is really one of those really magic things that needs to be in the guidebook to all parents of kids with ADHD. This is so unbelievably important because what ends up happening is the parents, most often the mom, ends up wearing all of these different hats for the child. And the moms are the ones that typically get the physical aggression against them, the verbal aggression against them, all of those sorts of things where they end up taking on too much and they become sort of that punching bag for the child to really go after. And that's really something that, is really unacceptable and does not need to happen. So this is something that all parents of kids with ADHD need to look into. If you live in an area where there's no family around, find some neighbors, find a coach, find a social worker, become friends with somebody in the community, someone, and just explain to them, "Hey, we're having a hard time with some executive dysfunction, dysregulation behaviors in the home. Would you be okay with talking with Steve once a week or twice a week, whatever it may be? Just do a quick 5-minute FaceTime once a week." This is one of those things where parents just find that one or two people, broach it to them. And a lot of adults really are kind of surprisingly quite willing to do it. They're like, "Sure, thanks for thinking of me. I think that's kind of cool. This is my chance to kind of be a role model or a big brother or like a wacky uncle to somebody, whatever it may be." But I think this is really one of those accommodations and one of those strategies that I think is just really just like such an unbelievably important thing. If you're dealing with physical aggression at home, constant fights, find a way to enlist a supporter somehow so that those behaviors can be known to a neutral third party, somebody else. And I've seen unbelievable progress from this tactic alone.
I also want to clarify for everybody, supporters do not need to be somebody who they see in person. So if the supporter lives across the country, that's fine. They can talk to them on the phone, they can talk to them over Zoom, whatever it is. So just know that, supporters can be anywhere and, they don't have to be like physically able or anything. They just have to be somebody who can reach out to your child. I think what Mike was talking about was, with the neighbor, something that it's good to have that face-to-face contact. And sure, it is. But if that's not possible, then use Zoom for that face-to-face contact. Because, it's one thing to talk on the phone. I mean, that is effective, but it's another thing, if your child has to look face-to-face at one of the supporters, when they're talking to them. So just keep that in mind as well. Mike, do you want to go over the last one here?
Sure, of course. So know that things may get worse before they get better. This is so unbelievably important, and this has to do with all strategies, all parenting advice. Everything in the age of parenting Parents have to get out of this mindset of that magic pill, that quick fix. So this is, we talk about the ADHD brain and their need for instant gratification and getting that screen addictions. Sometimes parents can get so exhausted and so burnt out, they're looking for success right away. I can't tell you how many times I've posted a video, a reel about a strategy, a tactic to use, and a parent writes back to me and says, tried it this morning, didn't work. This is stupid. This is dumb. Or a parent signs up for coaching and there's no progress after one session. They're like, what's going on? What happened? That's not realistic for anything. Your kid didn't learn to walk in one day or crawl or ride a bike or learn to read or write or anything like that. There's never going to be success instantly. You as the parent have to stay consistent and stay steady, and you're modeling that persistence to your child. And when your child realizes, hey, I'm not getting as much arguing as I used to. I'm not getting as much negotiating as I used to. I'm not getting as stimulated as I used to from being the center of attention and being able to manipulate with my emotions. When they realize, hey, there's a parenting shift here, and things aren't working out in my favor like the way they used to, they may turn it up a notch. The ADHD kid and teen tool belt is quite handy, and they have a lot of tools in their tool belt with learned helplessness and persistent. It may start with increased anger, increased aggression. Then they might go towards more negative self-talk to really pull at those heartstrings. And then they may go towards just sitting in their room, and they'll do whatever they can to get your attention and pull you in from anger and aggression to sadness and depression and anxiety and all sorts of things. So they're going to throw all those things at you to try to throw you off your game. And it's your job as a parent to stay consistent, keep using these strategies, keep those expectations high, and the ADHD child rises to the occasion.
One of the things I always explain to parents when I'm helping them reduce family accommodation, and I explain things are likely going to get worse before they get better. And they often say, well, for how long? And I say, I can't tell you, that really depends on how persistent, your kid is and how long this is going to go on for. But what I want you to understand is this. The reason why things are getting worse is because this feels like a loss of control to them. And they have to mourn the loss of control before they get used to the new normal. So like everything Mike was saying, just keep in mind that reducing family accommodation feels like a loss of control to them.
That's exactly it. So that's the biggest thing is they get stuck in this comfort zone of, there's a reason why they love being within the walls of the home so much, because that's where the screens are and that's where the parents are. That's where mom is. And that's where they can become that's where they can have the microphone, the stage, and everyone is just there to, follow their orders and focus on them. So their ability to manipulate the entire household to focus on them is highly stimulating to them. And when you step into your parental authority, like we talked about, and have those clear expectations, walk away from the dysregulation, walk away from the arguing, walk away from the negotiating, all of a sudden it's, hey, my old tactics didn't work anymore. And like Ryan said, they have to mourn the loss of that. So it's going to take some time. Just like when you take screens away from a child, you're not going to see a more regulated child right away. They're going to do every single thing they can, every tool in their tool belt, in their toolkit, to get those screens back. They're going to get angry. They're going to show sadness. They're going to say, you're the worst parent ever. None of my friends' parents have screen time limits. How dare you do this? I'm going to lose all my friends because you took my phone away. They're going to say all these different things to pull at your heartstrings to get that phone back, get those screens back. And they're going to do the exact same thing when you stop accommodating their inflexibility, when you stop accommodating their dysregulation. They're going to do every tool in their toolbox to get you to do those things again because they were so stimulated by it. So it's going to take time.
And, keep in mind, reducing family accommodation can, particularly for kids with anxiety, that can raise their anxiety. And that's not a bad thing. But, I've seen plenty of times kids threaten to kill themselves when the parents, stop accommodating their anxiety, or stop accommodating their, excessive screen time. So just keep in mind, like this can feel very serious when you stop doing this. Okay? I'm not saying that to scare anybody, but I do want to be realistic because this is something, I hear about pretty regularly. So before we finish up, I do want to give a plug for a book. If you're interested in reading more about this, the book that I typically recommend to parents is called Courageous Parents by Dr. Chaim Omer. and you can find that on Amazon. It's a really comprehensive book that helps parents learn to reduce family accommodation. That is really kind of the main approach I use, is what you'll find in that book there. So highly recommend it. And other thing before we finish up, we just wanted to thank everybody who has taken the time to leave us a positive review on Spotify or Apple Podcasts, whatever. We really appreciate you taking the time to do that. And for the few of you who chose to leave a negative review, we get it. You couldn't make it more obvious that you hate men, and that's okay. Thanks for listening, and thanks for taking time out of your day to leave a negative review. We appreciate you.
Exactly. Like Ryan and I say, sometimes hearing the truth is not easy. And we're not here for we're thanking the positive reviewers, but we're not here for likes and follows and clicks and shares. We just want to help people. Like Ryan says, real help right now. We're here to help people in the best way we possibly can. We're not here to make people feel good. The best advice in life is the kind of advice that makes you feel a little uncomfortable, that makes you look within and say, yeah, I can do things differently. And that's really what we're doing, is we're talking about things that have decades of research behind them, not these social media fads that are getting lots of likes and follows and shares.
And to Mike's point, all growth is a little uncomfortable. So when you reduce family accommodation, you should feel uncomfortable because you're growing and you're doing something that's going to benefit your child. And any kind of growth or change can be uncomfortable for everybody. So just keep that in mind, that it's completely normal.
Absolutely. And we certainly hope you've learned a lot from this episode. We would love for you guys to reach out to us and email us. So please send us messages. Like we mentioned earlier in the podcast about PDA and a lot of individuals following low demand parenting. I can't tell you how many parents have reached out to me and said, Mike, I'm stuck in a huge rut right now because I followed low demand parenting that I learned about on Instagram. And sharing those stories with other parents who were on the cusp of following low demand parenting saved them a massive headache. So if you're a listener out there and you previously followed low demand parenting and it took you in the total wrong direction and did not help, send us a message. Tell us about it. Tell us the story. Email us at ADHDguyspodcast@gmail.com. Send us messages. We're going to do a mailbag episode soon. Send us questions, things you want to know, topics, ideas. We would love to interact with our great community. People sharing this podcast. I've heard overwhelming positive responses, tons of positive reviews, lots of great DMs and messages. So please, we would love to interact with the ADHD Guys community and have some guests in the future. So if you have a question you would like Ryan and I to specifically answer, you can email us at the ADHDguyspodcast@gmail.com, and your question and your message may be featured on our next mailbag episode.
And just know you don't have to put your whole name if you don't want. You can just put your initials or just put your first name, whatever you want. But we do have episodes where we answer parents' questions. So feel free to submit one, and we will talk to you soon.
Thanks for listening. To learn more about Mike's practice, Grow Now ADHD, please visit his website, grownowadhd.com. To learn about the services Ryan provides, please visit ADHDdude.com. You can find Mike on Instagram at GrowNowADHD and Ryan on the ADHD Dude YouTube channel. We'd love to hear your feedback or questions, so feel free to contact us at the ADHD Parenting Podcast @gmail.com. The ADHD Parenting Podcast and content posted by Grow Now ADHD or ADHD Dude are presented solely for general information and educational purposes. Our goal is to provide valuable insights and knowledge, not to replace professional services. Mike and Ryan cannot provide clinical consultation or free advice through social media or other forms of communication. The information on this podcast is not a substitute for professional advice. If you or your child have any medical or mental health concerns, please consult your healthcare professionals.